Hi Year 9, Mrs. Kettle again. Hope you're all okay. Welcome to week 2 of your English lessons. I hope that you found last week's lessons okay and that you understood the poem that we were looking at. This week we're going to look at a second poem then, and that is As Imperceptibly as Grief. So like last week, if you can make sure that you have your fact book in front of you and the relevant poem for you to annotate them, please. Okay then, what I want you to do for the first 2 minutes of this lesson is just to, wherever you are, just spend 2 minutes looking out of the window. Now you do this every day, but maybe without looking in so much detail, you don't notice, things. So what I would like you to do is just to spend 2 minutes looking out of the window, and then I want you to write down 3 short descriptions of the most tiny detail that you can spot. Maybe that you have managed to spot now that you've never noticed before, please. So pause this presentation and write down your findings for me. Okay, as our starter today then, I want us to think about what the term grief means. Obviously in the title of today's poem you've got As Imperceptibly as Grief, but what actually does the word grief mean? So to help you, I've got the dictionary definition. Grief is intense sorrow, especially caused by someone's death. Now, what I'd like you to do is I would like you to tell me how grief affects people. Okay, how does it affect people emotionally? And how does it affect people physically? So just spend a couple of minutes just writing down some notes on your initial thoughts about grief. Okay, so we're going to read the poem As Imperceptibly as Grief then. You can either pause this and read it to yourself, or if you'd rather listen to me on the next slide reading this, then you can do. So, as imperceptibly as grief, the summer lapsed away, too imperceptible at last to seem like perfidy. A quietness distilled as twilight long begun, or nature spending with herself sequestered afternoon. The dusk drew earlier in, the morning foreign shone, a courteous yet harrowing grace, as guest that would be gone. And thus, without a wing or service of a keel, our summer made her light escape into the beautiful. First things first, there's a few words within that poem that you may find difficult and you do not know the meaning of. That is absolutely fine. What I would like you to do is to highlight the words that you see in bullet points on your screen for me, and then I would like you to find the definition to those words. So you can either use a dictionary on your laptop computer, or if you've got a dictionary to hand, a copy of a dictionary, then use that instead. It's entirely up to you. An extension task then is to write a sentence for each new word so that you are clear of the meaning. Pause the presentation now and have a go at that one for me. And when you have completed, you should have these definitions. So you should have imperceptibly means when something's hardly noticeable. Perfidy is if you're being deceitful or untrustworthy. Distilled, heated to extract something. Twilight is that soft glowing light from the sky when the sun is just below the horizon. The word sequestered means isolated or hidden away. And a keel is part of a ship that supports the framework. And then I've also got 3 other words on my screen. So courteous is polite and respectful. Harrowing is really distressing. And lapsed is when something's kind of expired, it's out of date. I don't know whether you can see that on your screen. If not, then just make a note of it as I'm saying. So lapsed is when something's expired, it's out of date. So this poem in a nutshell then. The whole stanza is talking about the fact that summer is over. the summer lapsed away. However, the poem describes the passing of summer and the onset of autumn. The fact that summer is making her light escape. However, this is compared to the passing of grief over time. As summer and grief fades, the poet feels resentful at first, but towards the end of the poem seems to understand that a new start is welcomed. At the end of the poem, the speaker comes to understand that something positive has come out of the grieving process. So the end of summer seems to represent the end of grief in this poem. It's talking about the grieving process ending so subtly that the passing of grief should be something that is celebrated. Now, this is a really, really tricky poem, but we're just going to try our best to understand as much as we can. So, as subtle as grief, summer has slipped away. It was too gradual to seem like betrayal, so the season changed into autumn without the person even realising. It was sudden. It grows quiet in the dusk, like nature is having an afternoon of rest. But then as it gets darker earlier and the sun rises later, it's done quietly. Yet it's disturbing to the speaker because they don't want summer to end. Now maybe they don't want the grief to end. And remember, the whole stanza is talking about summer being over, but this is an extended metaphor for what happens to the speaker's grief. Now I'm hoping that as we go through the annotations for this poem, it becomes a little bit clearer. So a little bit about Emily Dickinson then. She wrote many poems and letters to friends and acquaintances, but her work was only published after her death. She was a recluse. Now by recluse I mean that it's somebody that rarely leaves home. Okay, they're wrapped up in their own world and they just stay within their own house. Okay, so she would have had to rely on the view from her window and descriptions from friends. She suffered loss quite often due to the death of family members and friends. And then you've got these facts here. Her bedroom overlooked a graveyard. 5 of her friends were buried there. She lived in the same house for most of her life, and she liked to write about politics and religion. Okay, so remember, she lived a lot of her adult life mainly in complete isolation, and her poems often discussed things like death and nature. So within this poem, you've got the key themes of death, the key themes of passing of time, and the natural world. Okay, so we're going to go through the poem line at a time to help you with this understanding for the rest of the lesson. So make sure that you've got that poem in front of you, you've got a highlighter, you've got a pen, you've got a pencil, whatever it is that you're using to make annotations. We've got the first 4 lines. As imperceptibly as grief, the summer lapsed away. Too imperceptible at last to seem like perfidy. So the use of summer here could represent happiness, the peak time in life, and the fact that death is approaching. Okay, the fact that you have grief and it's capitalized here with the capital letter is maybe showing that grief is universal to all. Okay, it transitions from this really sharp pain in the beginning to one of acceptance once you've been through the grieving process. Here, too imperceptible at last to seem like perfidy. Okay, imperceptible is used to echo that both summer and grief can slip away unnoticed. You've got, which I forgot to include, the fact that summer lapsed away. Remember that lapsed means the passing of time, the passing of grief. And then to seem like perfidy, summer passes too slowly to be considered disloyal. So remember, it's the comparison of grief with summer. suggesting it's a natural process, it's universal to human experience. Okay. Then we go on, a quietness distilled as twilight long begun, or nature spending with herself sequestered afternoon. So you've got the fact that it's talking about twilight, just here on the second line here, suggests the natural cycle of day and night will continue forever. But this could be linked to Dickinson and her secluded lifestyle. Grief continues to grow darker and long begun shows a melancholic tone. Now by melancholic I mean this feeling of sadness, because this is taking over her happiness. You've got the two words quietness and sequestered, and both of these words, which I've put in bold on the screen for you, show the isolation and the loneliness of grief, and the fact that she's being cut off from the rest of the world. Okay. The dusk drew earlier in, the morning foreign shone, a courteous yet harrowing grace, as guest that would be gone. So the dusk drew earlier in, the dusk is coming earlier each day, and evening is making her feel more sad. We realise here that time is uncontrollable, but also an alternative interpretation here could be that dusk could symbolise the fading of her grief. And then you've got this word that I've put in bold, morning, the morning foreign shone. Morning symbolises the end of grief. However, the fact that it's foreign implies that this is a really strange feeling, because she doesn't want to leave the grief behind. She doesn't recognise this feeling of not feeling grief, if that makes sense. She doesn't recognise the happiness. And then here you've got this oxymoron, harrowing grace. Although this should be a positive moment, to her it seems painful and frightening. It's quite unsettling to her, because actually, what comes after grief? And how is she supposed to react? And then we're talking about this morning being a guest. Okay, as guest that would be gone, implying that everything must come to an end at some point, even if you don't want it to. So by this harrowing grace, going back to this oxymoron, it's representing her contradictory feelings. She's not quite sure how she feels about grief coming to an end. And then this last four lines, and thus without a wing or service of a keel, our summer made her light escape into the beautiful. So at the beginning you've got and thus shows a shift in tone, showing that maybe she's now ready to move on. You've got the fact of a wing and a keel, and they're needed to help movement, to help her escape. However, she's saying she doesn't need that anymore. So maybe summer, grief, doesn't need this support, because it's part of the natural process of accepting grief and moving forward. You've got the fact of this, our summer made her light escape. By using our, it suggests that her grief is universal, and the speaker accepts that it's not just her who's feeling this way. And the poem ends positively. By using the word beautiful, the use of the full stop shows the speaker accepts the change that has taken place and the finality of her grief. Now remember, grief can often depress and overwhelm, but there is always hope that something positive will transcend, which is ultimately beautiful. I hope this makes sense to you, Year 9. I realise that we've gone through pretty quickly, but by the end of this, your key facts are now on the screen that you should remember, and you will be tested on these at some point when we come back to school. Thank you, and I will see you for lesson 2. Bye, Year 9.